During the Second World War, there were many stories of soldiers and civilians switching sides and defecting over to their enemies. Some high-profile examples of these are William Joyce Lord Haw, who broadcast Nazi propaganda to British listeners, or John Amory, who was a British fascist who collaborated with the Nazis to try and recruit soldiers into the British Free Corps, a section of the Waffen-SS made up of former British prisoners of war. However, one lesser-known story is that of Antonina Makarova, a Soviet woman who defected over to the side of the Nazis and collaborated with them, carrying out deadly and brutal acts against Soviet partisans and civilians. She became known as Tonya the Machine Gun Girl, and she became a brutal executioner for the Nazis despite being Soviet. So join us today as we look at Hitler's brutal Soviet executioner, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Antonina Makarova was born in a small village in 1920. Little is known about her early life, however she was allegedly so shy that she forgot her last name whilst at school. She studied later in Moscow, but when the Second World War broke out, she ended up joining the Red Army. Women were allowed to serve within the Red Army. Initially they were turned away, but some even became soldiers after Stalin changed his rules to make up for the huge initial losses caused by Operation Barbarossa. Makarova became a volunteer nurse and tended to the injuries of wounded soldiers brought from the battlefield. Whilst being a nurse, she also took courses in how to handle weapons, including a machine gun, which she would later use to devastating effect. She did not remain as a nurse for long, as in autumn 1941, around 600,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded by the Germans, and Antonina was part of this. She managed to escape the enemy by wandering for months through the forest and villages, and she would shelter with locals for a short amount of time, before then again moving on. In the summer of 1942, she came across a village of Lokot, which was under German occupation. The region she was inside of was different to others living under the Nazis. It was being used as an experiment, and a local governance had been set up by Konstantin Voskoboynik, who was then later replaced by Bronislav Kaminski. The area was established to maintain order, and the region was allowed to create defensive units, which later became the Russian National Liberation Army. This was ultimately a group of Soviets who fought under Nazi command. The units became known for brutality and would later barbarically put down the Warsaw Uprising, massacring large amounts of the population. These soldiers in particular, who belonged to the RONA, were deemed traitors, and many were happy to conduct Nazi atrocities. Antonina had to make a decision. She could either try to link up with the partisans who were nearby in the forest. However, she saw that the Soviet collaborators were living in luxury compared to these. She then integrated herself with the group in the Germans and slept with German soldiers and attended many parties. Within a short amount of time, she then became involved in military matters. She was hired by the Germans to become a machine gunner, and it was in this role that she became a feared and brutal executioner. She was given the job to execute Russian prisoners of war and partisans, and also their families, including wives and children. This was a bloody job, but she seemed okay to carry this out. She was ordered to execute groups of 27, the number which a local prison could hold. The executions would take place near to a former stud farm, and Makarova lived in the same building. Often the locals would describe how the gates of the prison were opened, and a group of prisoners were then led out of the prison, followed by a cart which held a machine gun, with a young woman, Makarova, sat behind on it. She would then open up the machine gun on the prisoners, executing them in cold-blooded fashion. She later told investigators, "I didn't know these people I shot, and they didn't know me, so I felt no shame for them. For me, all those sentenced to death were the same, only their number changed. The arrested were lined up in a pit. One of the men rolled my machine gun to the execution site. At the command of my superiors, I knelt down and fired until everyone fell dead." It was later said that German and Hungarian generals would come to watch the spectacle, with the female executioner slaying her fellow citizens with the machine gun. She never missed, but if there was a prisoner who wasn't killed by her bursts of fire, she would then go up behind them and finish them off with a pistol shot to the head. There was one occasion where a number of children survived, with the bullets flying above their heads. They played dead and were later saved by the locals, who were forced to bury the victims, and then they were passed over to the partisans, who promised to hunt down the female executioner who had massacred their parents. After an execution, Makarova took off the clothing of the dead and often stole their possessions. She became known as Tonya, the machine gun girl, for these shootings, using her Maxim machine gun for the job. She believed these executions were necessary and a normal part of warfare, and sometimes 3 group executions were carried out a day. It's believed that she shot dead 1,500 people during her time spent executing for the Germans. For carrying it out, she was given 30 Reichsmarks, and her notorious reputation came before her. In the summer of 1943, she was sent to a German hospital for treatment for syphilis, and this saved her from being captured by the Red Army, who later liberated Lokot. They found the graves of those 1,500 executed by Makarova, and with this the hunt was on for the shooter or the shooters. She claimed she was a Soviet nurse and stole a military ticket from a murdered prisoner, and she managed to escape justice working as a nurse in a hospital. She later met her husband, taking his surname, and the couple settled in Lapel and had 2 daughters. Post-World War II, she worked at a clothing factory, but eventually she would be caught. The Soviet military police and the KGB had been looking for Tonya the machine gun girl since 1943, and they had very few witnesses and pieces of information about her. No one knew her name, and the search continued for a long time. In 1973, the KGB interrogated another collaborator who said he knew about the machine gunner. One of Antonina's brothers even told the KGB how his sister was Antonina Makarova and was now living as Antonina Ginsburg. A secret KGB operation was planned, and several witnesses confirmed her as the executioner. She was then arrested and taken to Bryansk, where she was placed in prison. Whilst here, she was noted to have behaved rather calmly, answering all of the questions clearly. During questioning, she did not talk about her family and did not even want to speak with them. Her husband was told of her true identity, and he then took his daughters and left. She believed that as decades had passed since her murderous actions, that she would simply be pardoned or given a few years in prison and then released. But this is not what happened. The court decided that she too should face up to the crimes that she committed, with the ultimate sentence. She was sentenced to death, and despite it not being possible to highlight the fact she executed 1,500 people, it was confirmed that she was responsible for at least 168 of those. At 6 a.m. on the 11th of August 1979, Antonina Makarova was brought into an execution courtyard. Facing her was a firing squad. She was tied to a stake, and then the men readied their weapons and shot straight into the infamous female Nazi executioner. She was 59 years old when she was executed, and it closed a chapter on one of the biggest KGB manhunts ever ordered. Her execution for some was penance for the cruelty she inflicted, but her own daughter released a statement on the woman she only knew as her mother, and not the executioner. She said, "Pain, pain, pain. She spoiled the life of 4 generations. You would like to know whether I would take her back if she returned? I would. She's my mother after all. I really don't know how to remember her, as if she is alive or dead. According to the law, women were not shot. Maybe she's alive somewhere. And if not, tell me. I'll finally light a candle for her soul." It appears with this that she was slightly in denial at the fate her mother met, with her being executed by the firing squad. She was one of only 3 women executed by the Soviet Union following the death of Stalin. So Antonina Makarova, or Tonya the machine gun girl, was an executioner who, despite being raised in the Soviet Union and working for the Red Army as a nurse, defected over to the enemy. With the defection and job she was given to become an executioner, it attracted a lot of interest, where her shooting of prisoners of war would be met with watchful eyes from generals. Seeing the female Soviet mowing down the people with her machine gun attracted a great degree of intrigue by those around her. She ultimately met her own justice, being executed over 30 years after the Second World War came to an end. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.